Hey there, welcome back to the Avatar Vlogs. This is episode 10, Jet. And admittedly, this is kind of, to me at least, one of the lesser episodes of the show. It's not bad. It's not bad. It's not nearly as good. And especially compared to some of the recent stretches of episodes, this is not bad. Not good, not bad. Well, I'll tell you more after the plot synopsis. So, Aang and the gang are in a forest camping out when Sokka suggests that maybe instead of that they should traverse on foot because he figures that the Fire Nation is tracking everyone so easily because good old Appa, because he's a giant buffalo beaver with an arrow on his head, and not surprisingly, he's very difficult to track in that regard. So he convinces the gang to travel on foot. They don't like it, and they end up coming across a group of Fire Nation soldiers anyway, but luckily they're saved by a man named Jet and his troop of freedom fighters who take the gang into their custody, into their hospitality, I guess you could say. And Sokka's not very trusting of Jet, but Aang and Katara find him to be very charming. Aang mostly because Jet kind of lives the life of a carefree kid, which, to Aang and all the responsibilities he has to face seems very appealing. And Katara herself is getting a bit of a crush on this rogue rapscallion. So there's that. And they go back to their village, which kind of looks like a cross between the Ewok village and Neverland from Hook. It's all like wood platforms in the trees. It looks okay, but it's very familiar. It's stuff we've seen before. But, not bad, just stuff we've seen before. Jet wants to, if you hear beeping, that's the air fryer going. I'm doing this very quickly. I'm trying to get some food after this. So, Jet wants to use Katara and Aang as part of a plan to, as he says, get the Fire Nation out of the valley once and for all. And again, Sokka's not overly trusting of him, but kind of goes for it long enough anyway, because, he's not leaving without his sister and his good friend. But as you might guess from the plot I've just described, it does turn out that Jet has ulterior motives, and his plan is to, in fact, flood the valley and the occupied Earth Kingdom town to get rid of the Fire Nation for sure, but basically destroy the town as it stands. So there's not a ton to talk about in this episode, at least not nearly as much as some of the others. It's an episode. I will admit, it's an episode that whenever it did come on as a kid, I'd watch it, but more so because it was part of the whole. It was never one of my favorites. Watching it now, though, something I noticed is that both in terms of the episode itself, but also in terms of its place in the overall story. I'm sorry, excuse me. In terms of the overall story, this episode is good. Is kind of mediocre setup to good payoff. Like in the episode itself, the setup is kind of weak, the payoff is really good. And this episode, in terms of the overall story of Avatar, is kind of a weak setup, but it does lead to some very good stuff. Jet and some of the freedom fighters will make appearances in later episodes, and it does get very good with her. But here, kind of not exactly the best start. So the story, as I mentioned, it does kind of go more the direction you think it's going to go, where it turns out that this supposedly noble freedom fighting group has ulterior motives and is in fact a lot darker and more extreme than they initially let on, which is not a bad message. I honestly think in kids media, and especially ones that kind of have an anti-war message, it's really important that you do kind of establish that ultimately extremism is the true enemy in all of these things. Like, it doesn't matter what side of the conflict you're on. It's when you start usually from a basic point, but then you just get to these massive extremes one way or another. That's the true enemy, because you've lost the plot, you've lost focus of what was important, and it spirals out. So in that way, I think this episode actually does really deliver well on its message. The whole episode basically exists solely not only to kind of see the fight between Aang and Jet, which is not one of the better ones, but it's kind of interesting because it is showing how Aang is much more of a pacifist in how he wants to do things. Like, he doesn't outright refuse to fight Jet, but he refuses to fight Jet to harm him. He's always using his airbending more or less to defend himself and push Jet away, as opposed to actively try and strike him down with the air or whatever. So, and that's going to kind of become another theme in the show going forth too, about how there's sort of a right way, not a right way and a wrong way, but there's kind of a right way to go about. I don't want to use the word pacifist, because a lot of people use pacifism to think you just refuse to fight and you're a coward. But no, it's non-violent, I guess I should say. It's sort of a leaning towards non-violence, but with the understanding that you don't, you can choose to not use violence, but sometimes, no matter what the situation is, you have to. But it all depends on the scenario. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. But the whole episode is basically building up to this talk with Jet and Sokka, where, after it turns out that Sokka got ahead and warned the village before Jet was able to enact his plan, and he saved everyone. And Jet calls him a traitor because he said the village was about to be free. Well, who would be free, Jet? Everyone would be dead. Sokka, you're a traitor. No, Jet. You became the traitor once you stopped protecting innocent people. That's kind of what this whole episode was building up to, and I think in that way it did deliver. The reason I have my own disappointments with this episode is I really like what it could have been. So, as mentioned, Jet and his freedom fighters are kind of like Robin Hood-esque. It's not just in the sense that they live in the woods and they kind of fight the villainous imperialistic forces, for the sake of the common man, but in the sense that all these people who are part of Jet's crew are, usually kids or people who were affected by the Fire Nation at a young age, whether they were displaced from their village or their parents were killed, that they suffered some sort of, or even none of that. Maybe they just suffered a really bad traumatic childhood. Jet found them and kind of gave them a place not only they could belong, but they could really truly grow into their own. There's one character in this who's named Pipsqueak, which is ironic because he's a great big guy who they never really go into his backstory, but I think part of it is because he is such a simple-minded guy. Jet's crew kind of gave him a place where not only could he belong, but he could find purpose and he could excel in what little he does know. And that's the stuff I would have liked this episode to dive into a little more. You can still have the fights. You could have had Jet, honestly, I get what they're going for about how, nature versus nurture. Sometimes your childhood affects how you go about things. Extremism is bad. That's fine, but I kind of really would have liked if they dived more into the nature of this group. Because it has all these characters who, in this episode, are not developed the greatest. They're kind of given a very basic backstory, and they don't go much further than that, which is fine. You can do that, and they did do that, but I just really would have liked if they dived into that part a little bit more, go more so for the depth of character rather than just kind of the simplicity, because Avatar as a show is really good about depth of character. It almost doesn't matter who the character is. They really try to get a lot of depth out of these people, and here they just kind of don't do that. But as I mentioned, Jet does come back into the show later, and it is to much better effect. So this episode, again, the theme of this episode, not the theme, but kind of the theme of the nature of the structure of this episode. By God, that's a pretentious thing. That's almost John Malkovich level of pretentious. It's kind of a weak setup that leads to a good payoff. And honestly, that's about it. This isn't one of the better ones, but this is, in many respects, an important episode. It did set up a character who's going to come back in the future. It did give a good, decent message. I think that message about extremism is always important, kind of no matter what time something comes out. It's always really important to keep, to remember and hold on to. But with that said, not much more to say here. I'll see you in the next one. Onwards and upwards, my friends.